The decision by the Obama administration to send additional forces to Afghanistan is a strategic one. It aims basically at strengthening the NATO coalition presence in that country to support the local government and to make sure that neither the Taliban nor Al-Qaeda are going to be coming back and bringing down the democratically elected government and reinstalling what was known then in the 90s until Tora Bora as the Taliban Emirates, which basically is a jihadi regime which wants to create in Afghanistan a basis for expansion of this ideology and also of jihadi terror against neighbors, the region, and eventually against governments and societies around the world. And we've seen one of their targets on 9/11. Now, the U.S. policy is to maintain the status quo that exists on the military level in Afghanistan and to enhance the capacity of the government, and that means the capacity of the security forces of the army. And we know that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and their supporters have been launching these attacks against the government in the goal of bringing down the democratically elected government and replace it with either the return of a Taliban regime or of a sort of a coalition government where the Taliban will be part of the regime. And we know in jihadi strategies that even a coalition government where the Taliban, a non-reformed armed Taliban, will be back into power, that would be a prelude to bring back the full-fledged power of the Taliban. So the question now is, knowing that the Obama administration is going to bring in additional forces to most likely practice in Afghanistan the theory of the surge that was practiced in Iraq. The issue is for how long? What is the measurement which is going to allow the local government in Afghanistan, the national government in Afghanistan, to expand its own capacity, their own armed forces, to do exactly what the US and NATO and coalition forces are doing in Afghanistan? When will Afghanistan be able, as a government and as a society, to contain and eventually to reverse the influence of the Taliban? That is the second example of how the Obama administration is going to be facing the same conflict, the same crisis that the Bush administration has faced since 2001. And that is going to tell us that whatever strategies to be adopted on the military level, but also on the political level, those strategies are going to determine the success of maintaining that space of freedom for the Kabul government, the democratically elected government in Kabul, to win their own battle. And as in Iraq, the success of this escalation in Afghanistan is going to make or break the future of the entire US policy, not just in Afghanistan, but also on the regional scale. And here are the windows, the openings we'd like to be very attentive to. If US and NATO forces are successful in increasing the level of security, meaning in defeating the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, would that mean that once they will begin to withdraw and redeploy within Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan, the Afghani armed forces can do the same? That's the big question. And how to ensure that a post-withdrawal in Afghanistan will maintain the country under the protection and the defense of Afghans' national defense forces? Well, you've got to have a society in Afghanistan which supports its own army and its own government. To have such a society, you need to make sure that there is a majority of Afghanis who, regardless of their political divisions, have one consensus on the establishment of a democratic society in the country. So yes, at the end of the road, what you have in Afghanistan is probably similar to what has been there in Iraq in terms of challenge. How do you get there? How do you make sure that there is a Afghani society which is willing to fight for its own democracy and its own freedom? The American role, both in Iraq and in Afghanistan, is just about opening a space of freedom. It cannot create societies. The question here is, if the U.S. policy in Afghanistan, unlike in Iraq, is open-ended, meaning there is no time limit so far, then the question would be, what is it that Washington will have to wait to see happening to put a time limit or a program for an eventual withdrawal from Afghanistan? Because, yes, the debate took place in Iraq, and it will take place again in Afghanistan. Even with a U.S. and NATO success, militarily speaking, there will always be this question, till when? Till when this democracy is going to be working only with the support of a military force which is not Afghani? This is the second major challenge. A third major challenge for the Obama administration in the region is definitely going to be the Arab-Israeli issue, but more specifically the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or may we call it the peace process, which did not develop yet. And even more specifically, after the Gaza war of 08 and 09, the Hamas-Israel conflict. Now, that is a conflict that the Bush administration has inherited from decades of confrontation between Arabs and Israelis, Palestinians and Israelis. But more specifically, today's situation between Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza has to do with a force which is not part of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, which is not part of the Mahmoud Abbas leadership of the Palestinian Authority, or any successor to Mahmoud Abbas. This is a force, i.e. Hamas, which has an ideological agenda, which has a very clear doctrine, but as important, which is ally to regional forces, including the Syrian regime and including the Iranian regime. So that is a crisis which is going to be addressed, but not just addressed from a Palestinian/Israeli perspective, but from a regional perspective. Any initiatives, including the ongoing negotiations or envoy mission to the Middle East, which is not going to take into consideration that behind Hamas, you're talking about a whole web, a whole network of forces. Any U.S. policy which is not going to take this into consideration is going to deal with the same components of the problem, and most likely even greater crisis in the future. A fourth challenge the Obama administration is going to be addressing is going to be the whole situation in Lebanon and between Lebanon and Syria. That's the fourth corner of this web of knots of problems. Well, here again, under the Bush administration, a massive change took place in Lebanon in 2005 in what was called the Cedars Revolution, meaning a majority of the Lebanese rose against the Syrian occupation and called for the withdrawal of the Syrians, and called also for the disarming of all militias, including Hezbollah. Up until May of 08, one component of this rise of will among the Lebanese, strengthened with the United Nations Resolution 1559, backed by the Bush administration then, and France and other quarters, was to evacuate the Syrian army from Lebanon. What remained basically is the issue of the weapons of Hezbollah. Now, the Obama administration has inherited this situation whereby Hezbollah came back to power in Lebanon, is projecting itself as a major power broker in Lebanon. So now the question is going to be, what will Washington do? Would they actually engage with Iran, with Syria, and therefore with Hezbollah to negotiate a new status quo in Lebanon? Or are they